for about, gosh, what month is it now? 6 months, 7 months. The Conservancy was created in the 1990s to raise funds for, or what, if you guys remember, there were a few years ago. But since that time, it's evolved to do a lot more than just raise funding. It is now an independent nonprofit that initiates its own capital projects, improves and activates our park's historic assets and natural lands, and strengthens the communities surrounding our park. Before I get too far into this discussion, I feel like I should disclose a few important facts about myself, because although I have always loved green spaces, this is me as a young child loving grass. And although I spent most of my youth in the Wissahickon Valley Park with my family, exploring, and although I've spent a lot of time leading Philadelphia Park groups, first at Friends of the Wissahickon and now with the goats at Fairmont Park Conservancy, I shamefully am not actually a scientist of any. I'm a cultural anthropologist by training. And that's one of the reasons why I can't really talk about the word nature without making really terrible puns about the dualistic meanings behind it. Because as we all know, nature has more than one meaning. There's the conventional first sense, that this idea of nature as a physical world that's independent of us humans and our human creations. And there's the sort of very anthropological secondary definition, which is the basic or inherent features of something, the baseline characteristics. It's when we talk about the nature of things or human nature. And I really enjoy my stupid puns about nature, because I believe that when it comes to urban parks, those two definitions of the words are not really separable at all. Humans are always the biggest factor impacting any landscape that we inhabit, even if we often don't even recognize the results of our own handiwork. So it's really surprisingly easy for us as humans to confuse the landscapes that we've modified with natural or untouched by human landscape. If you take a look at these two photos, you can sort of ask yourself, which one is a more natural landscape? On the left, we have a very laboriously installed and maintained private shade garden, which has great biodiversity, probably great, supporting a great number of insects and animal life in a way that we believe evokes what a forest understory should look like. On the right, you see one of our forest understories in a Philadelphia forest, riddled with invasives. You can see devil's walking stick, knotweed, lesser celandine, an understory that is sparse, and what greenery you see in it is almost wholly invasive plants or aggressive local plants like devil's walking stick. It's easy for us humans to get confused in that case, because we have actually meddled equally in both of those landscapes. Both of those are created landscapes that are not natural by the first definition of the term, but they're extremely natural when you think of it as something that human beings do. Humans have meddled in all of the landscapes we interact with, and the question is, have we done it with intention? To most of us humans, the natural state of a landscape is the way it looks when we first happen upon it. So when I was a graduate student, I read about how people in South Africa, North America, and Australia created and managed grasslands and savannas with intentional controlled burns. And this is something that people still do all over the world today. When European colonizers arrived in these places, they often thought that the local inhabitants happened to have luckily stumbled upon this very fertile and rich grassland. And they didn't realize, in fact, that the local inhabitants had developed and shaped these natural resources to serve their needs. The land and its associated flora and fauna in these landscapes was altered intentionally. to meet the needs of its human inhabitants. And this habit of altering the land we live in to meet our needs is really something that is endemic to human nature. When I was the director of the Wissahickon, this tendency to see nature as something apart from humanity and to see the existing conditions in today's Wissahickon Valley Park as natural and to some extent eternal was something that I encountered very frequently. I had a board member who used to refer to the Wissahickon as America's first brownfield reclamation site. And that's because it was one of America's first brownfield reclamation sites. Before it became a park, it was an industrial corridor. And this is an old photo of historic Rittenhouse Town, where you can see that, pretty much the entire forest in the lower Wissahickon was once clear cut. Those rolling fields of grass are today very steeply forested hills. So the woods we see today in the Wissahickon, for instance, are very greatly changed from what the Lenape or early European colonists would have experienced coming into Philadelphia. Logging, development, invasive pests and plants, decades of dumping street waste. That was a strong policy in the city of Philadelphia. When they wanted to check erosion, they'd take all like broken up street things and chuck it into a gully in the Wissahickon. That's why you find interesting things like carpets and old lamps sometimes when you're hiking. These things have already altered and continue to alter the Wissahickon Gorge, woods, and creek. But that knowledge doesn't keep us. We know that it's been altered many times, but that knowledge doesn't keep us from aspirationally designating the Wissahickon as an old growth forest. In fact, there was a celebration several years ago in Carpenter's Woods saying, let's celebrate this old growth forest in the middle of the city. And of course, very, very few trees in the Wissahickon are over 150 years old. That's sort of the definition of an old growth forest. But we have, it's both an aspirational title, but also a recognition that to us, what we see before us is, our perception of how it's always been. It's old to us. It's an old growth forest to us. It feels eternal. It feels like this is the natural state of that land, and as if that's how this land has always been. But the placement and quality of our urban parks and natural resources are also things that change quite a bit. They're things that we have very frequently altered to great effect throughout our entire city, throughout our entire world. We'd like to think that there are areas of our city where nature just happens to be present and areas where it's not. But when we think about it, of course, we realize somebody somewhere made a decision to place nature where we encounter it. They decided where that nature was needed or not needed. And we have sometimes as a society made heroic efforts to move nature further away from us, to bury it. So you can see in this map of Philadelphia's historic watersheds, this was the watersheds on the left that were here before settlement, and today's watersheds. That was a huge effort to deliberately find and bury all of these tributaries across the city. It took centuries. And we very busily sort of invested our time, money, and social capital in doing this work. And I say that just to make the point that nature that we're celebrating and talking about today is really a very slippery concept. It's not straightforward. It's not easy. It's important to remember that the human alterations of the natural resources that we encounter should be considered natural. We are not, in fact, separable from the world around us. We are integral to it, and we cannot help but alter it. When it comes to urban spaces and urban parks, we have to understand that the first natural resource we need to prioritize and work around is, in fact, human nature. This should be a pretty easy sell, right? So as you can imagine, connecting human nature to nature should be really easy. We need the natural world. We need everything it brings us: clean air, clean water, biodiversity, food, the freedom to move, the freedom to explore, to connect with the world around us. It's such an obvious connection that one might ask oneself quite reasonably, why does an organization like the Fairmount Park Conservancy need to exist? Surely we can see what's good for us and invest in those things without help. Well, we can actually thank human nature for the need for the Conservancy as well. Access to parks, green as luxuries. And parks in Philadelphia, as we all know, have been chronically underfunded for decades. So this lack of investment in our parks has grown more obvious as economic divides in Philadelphia have grown. As a result, overgrown and unmonitored parks become a dangerous burden to their communities, filled with trash, illegal dumping, graffiti, sometimes the occasional tire fire, a whole bunch of behaviors that we don't want to see in our public realms. And that's a direct result of the underinvestment that we're chronically seeing throughout our communities in those connections to the natural space. These decisions that in this area, we don't need to maintain a connection to nature. This is where the most visible part of the Fairmount Park Conservancy's work usually lies. It's breaking that cycle of disinvestment and using financial or constructional or restoration projects to remove blight and recreate our park spaces. Some of the Conservancy's best known capital work was in the redevelopment of Hunting Park, where we restored some playing fields and amenities. And recently, we've, in the last few years, gotten into doing larger scale natural lands and forest canopy restoration. This is a site in West Park. And this helps us improve not only the biodiversity and health of these woodlands and the waterways that flow through them, but also to reconfigure what the public imagination is of what this space should look like. Similar to capital projects, we also do activations that are paired with maintenance work to help neighbors see a familiar site in a new way. That lets us transform something in our public realm that has been an eyesore or sort of a null space into something that's an asset that people want to engage with and use and move forward. So the Hatfield House activation is a good example of this. This paired community arts programming with the restoration of a historically little accessed historic house in the East Park area. And it's helped neighbors to create a sense of ownership and investment in the space while improving the appearance and functionality. And while the capital work and activations are essential to the work of the Conservancy, it's really the programming that we do with people that is critical to the nature of maintaining and restoring natural resources in Philadelphia. Here we have a beautiful picture of some of our Park Friends Network members. Philadelphia is rich in parklands, and we are rich in park friends. We have 100 Park Friends groups around the city serving our hundreds of parks. And one of the things that I think is really critical to the success of maximizing connections to nature in a city with as many challenges as Philadelphia is tapping into that human nature to maximize resources and protection for our natural area. We invest in people and community groups who want to come together and care for their parks, who want to use their parks, like folks in our We Walk program, or volunteer to maintain and restore their parks. And it's that work that's actually the true transformational work, altering the way humans are engaging with their landscapes. So that brings us to today. We're in kind of a funny time right now, where we are seeing people forced into our public spaces due to the closure of pretty much most of the private spaces that they would ordinarily inhabit. So we've seen a lot of articles. I mean, I probably have seen 100 articles about public space and green space and remaking the world and what this means for us moving forward, and how we now have this newfound profound respect for our natural resources in our parks. And that is something that I certainly hope is going to be retained through this period, because it's something we desperately need, after all. And it's going to be something that we're needing even more now that these resources are really drying up. So we've never had abundant investment in our parks, but what we do have is abundant human capital to invest in our parks. So I think that although there are a lot of challenges ahead, and we have many complicated histories with the natural surroundings of our Philadelphia parklands and the communities that they serve. It's the strength of our human nature and the communities that are going to allow our parks to be resilient, even when we see catastrophic changes across our society. So hopefully we can look to our own nature and recognize our own needs to drive greater care for and social investment in a biodiverse natural parkland, because we need it to survive and thrive. And that's all. That's the end of my presentation. That was probably maybe a little short. I don't know.
I think that was good length.
Thank you, Maura.
Thanks, Maura.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that was great.
We have time now for some Q&A. And I do have to say that I feel better just having seen the pictures of nature, and also, wow, historic Rittenhouse town now and then. That was a really great pair of images. So we went through the raise your hand function during the introduction. So please, anybody who has a question for Maura, we would love to hear from you. All right. Hey, Trevor.
Hi there. Thank you, Maura.
Thanks, Trevor.
I don't know if you remember me, but I'm also part of the Friends of FDR Park.
I remember you very well because you are exceedingly well dressed.
There you go. Everyone, that's why I do it. See? Thank you for being with us. I hope in a post-quarantine environment, I can show you around the Navy Yard and we can chat nature.
I'd love that.
But I wanna know or get your perspective on, what do we do in our park spaces and while supporting people in a COVID environment, or the perception of wanting to stay distant but also celebrating being together? Any recommendations? Any no-nos?
That's a really great question. This is what we're working on with Parks and Recreation. Yeah, all the time right now, trying to figure out item. I know my internet is terrible, so sorry if I'm breaking up, guys. But you know, one of the things we're looking at is, you may go into the park and feel like you're surrounded by people, but the truth is that we're only really using heavily about 10 to 15% of our parklands in the city. We've got over 10,000 acres of parkland, and most Philadelphians or people from the region are using about 10 to 20% of that. So one of the challenges this summer is to get people to explore, to get people to engage in sort of take a deep dive in this land that like belongs to all of us, but we so seldom visit. So that's going to be the Conservancy's real focus, using temporary signage, online programming, some real world prompts. You know, we're going to try to overlay our work as much as possible with Parks and Rec direct service work to get that messaging about how to access public lands out. So yeah, it's really tricky. The desire to be together is incredibly strong. Did you guys see that park in Brooklyn where they put chalk circles on the grass? Yeah. I thought about that for FDR, and then I realized like nobody in FDR would actually stay in their circle. I think people in Brooklyn are better behaved than people in Philadelphia.